Hello and welcome everyone to today's episode of the Kianistan podcast. I was hoping to discuss Trump's recent peace proposal for the war in Ukraine. And for this, I reached out to Professor Vladimir Brovkin to get his views on this very important topic. And I'm grateful for him that he agreed to join us. Professor Brovkin, welcome back. And it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor, I follow your own YouTube channel closely, and I love the videos that you're making. I'll leave a link to that as well. If anyone isn't aware of it, they can go and join you. But recently I saw like you made a couple of really interesting videos, one about why the Europeans hate or dislike the Russians, which is one question I've always had on my mind, and I really enjoyed that video. And the other one was to do with Trump's peace plans, which is why I reached out to you. So tell us a little bit about, give us like an overview. What do you think are the key points in this peace proposal that Trump's come up with?
Yes, I'll do that. But also I can start by saying that the two issues, they are kind of related.
They are.
Yeah, they are. Because one of the ways the European leaders are acting the way they do, totally irrationally, is because it is emotional, because they, for reasons that I can elaborate on, really don't like the Russians, and especially Vladimir Putin. It's very easy to prove, because if you look at the history of Cold War relations between the Western countries and the Soviet Union, they were much, much warmer, even though they were officially on a Cold War, like one step away from a hot war. I mean, Brezhnev was coming to Paris, and Kissinger was coming to Moscow, and Willy Brandt started the Ostpolitik, and there were pretty good relations, and also not so bad with Great Britain as well. So it's a very interesting situation that today there's just total negativity. But we'll come back to it. First, your first question about Trump's plan. I guess for what is important for your listeners and for general public, without getting into the substance of each of those 28 points, is that it has 4 points that are crucial for Russia to that Putin actually is ready to accept it and negotiate the rest. And these are no membership of Ukraine in NATO, no foreign troops in Ukraine, no limitations on the armed forces of Ukraine, and also restoration of Russian language and Russian church. So these are, it's like if these are not there, there's no point for Russia to discuss anything anymore. And it is exactly on those that the Western leaders have picked as unacceptable. They find Zelensky and his European friends that there's no way they can have any limitations as a matter of principle, because this is very interesting. I just read that Ukraine before 2022 had 200,000 army, which is a normal size army. Germany has 175,000. Poland, with all its fears of Russia, has 300,000. Now, Ukraine in this proposal should have 600,000, double that of Poland. That's obviously not acceptable, because that's not reasonable. And the reason I think why they want such a big army is because the European soldiers are expensive, and the Ukrainians were cheap. And it seems to me that the war hawks in Europe want to use Ukrainian army in the future as a kind of a tool against Russia in case of any kind of complications. Anyway, so that's the bottom line. The issues are quite stark. It seems to me that the border issue is not the central one, even though they present it as a central one. And the reason they present it as a central one is because they want to make Russia as an aggressor. Russia attacked Ukraine, and therefore it's all about territory. No, it's not about territory, because it's not a war of Russia in Ukraine. It is a war between Ukrainian provinces that asked Russian protection. Let's not forget, it all started with the Crimea voting to secede from Ukraine after the Bandera nationalists seized power in a coup d'etat in 2014. After that, Donbass followed suit, And I remember those events very well. Crimea was immediately accepted into the Russian Federation, but Donbas, even though they had a referendum, it was the spring of 2015. To my great surprise, Putin stalled and said, yes, we should respect, but, and then he went for a compromise. And the compromise was that de jure, Donbas was supposed to stay Ukrainian, but de facto, it should have what all of Ukraine had: open borders with Russia, trade with Russia, and the rest of it. Now, the Ukrainians signed it, but didn't mean to keep it. And when they openly and officially broke it, which was January 2021, that's when Russia recognized those republics and admitted them to Russia. So, that just to show you that it's not just a clear-cut case of Russian aggression against poor Ukraine. No, it's a conflict between Russian Ukrainians and the rest of Ukrainians, a conflict that is very similar to many, many countries and many, many times in history when a province doesn't want to be to stay with a certain country.
That's so true. And so I'm just looking at the points that you mentioned, the points that 28 points that Trump has raised. And we've talked about the ones that are agreeable to Russia, but maybe if you can first talk about the ones that might be disagreeable to Russia, and then talk about the ones that are disagreeable to Europe or to Ukraine. And then maybe we can see if there's any bridge that can be built between those two positions. So what is unacceptable in those points to Russia?
Well, that's exactly the ones acceptable to Russia and important to Russia are the ones that Zelensky and his European friends do not want to accept, which is limitation on armed forces, future membership in NATO. That's Ukraine in the Ukrainian constitution. This is the original cause of the war, and also the presence of foreign troops. You see what is happening today in London. And with the support of President Macron, the coalition of the willing, they really want to have an opportunity to put the Western troops in Ukraine as a part of peacekeepers or whatever. They want to have this access for strategic purposes because they fear Russia, because in 1853 they attacked Russia to gain Crimea, the famous Crimean War. This is strategic. It's like historical. It's the Britain and France want to consider themselves great powers, and they just feel very upset when something is decided in Europe without their involvement. So the membership of NATO, the foreign troops, the number of armed forces, and also money and the investment. What the Europeans feel very upset that in Trump's plan, they're cut out of the 300 billion Russian funds, which Trump wants to use for joint fund with Russia. Russia feels that this is totally and completely Russian money that could be unfrozen when peace agreement is reached. That's another point of contention. What it seems to me is doable is that Russia may agree to a territorial compromise, but it absolutely has to have ironclad guarantees that there's no NATO expansion. That's item number one, that if that's not resolved, then war continues under any circumstances. That's crucial. That's the original cause of the war. Now, also, I must tell you that when I listen to Russian public opinion debates and Russian talk shows and journalists and others, and I'm telling you that it would be very, very difficult for Putin, with all his power and with all his reputation, to push through the plan as it is, without any changes that Rubio, introduced yesterday in favor of Ukraine. Russian public opinion says that this is Russian land. Ukraine split away from the USSR, and we accepted it, but we will not accept any part of it to be a part of NATO. The only thing that we can go for is a friendly, neutral country next to our borders, like Belarus. Nothing hostile to Russia, and that's the majority public opinion. Moreover, a lot of people in Russia are saying we should not have anything at all, no deal whatsoever with Zelensky regime, because he's not legitimate, because he's going to betray any deal. He's going to walk away as soon as he has a chance. So there's a growing sentiment not to sign anything with Zelensky, only after new elections are held and a legitimate government is formed. And even then, if they want to be in NATO, we'll continue the war. So this is a very difficult situation, because there's pressure on all sides. There's pressure inside Russia, and that's a serious pressure, because these are the army, these are the veterans, these are the patriotic people. Putin cannot really ignore them. So that's the pressure. On Zelensky, there's a pressure, of course, on his nationalists and his patriots or whatever, who cannot accept loss of territory and abandon NATO membership. So the way it looks to me now, this is irreconcilable. There's no way Trump can manipulate everybody to accept something that nobody wants. There has to be some kind of a resolution. It's possible. It's possible if there is a change of government in Ukraine, which may happen very quickly, because there is huge opposition to him in the Rada, in the parliament, and because there's a corruption scandal, and because they discredited, and because there are more nationalists in the name of Zaluzhny, the ambassador to London right now. So Zelensky faces two kinds of opposition. One is Zaluzhny, more nationalist, the super war heroes who want to continue the war, and the British support them, and the European Union support them, and they hope, this is their hope, that they can prevail, because, and this is what the Brits are saying and the French, that the economies of European Union are so much larger than Russia, that eventually 2 or 3 years down the road, Europe may be able to produce enough war material and fight to arm Ukraine to fight successfully. Moreover, the Russians are afraid of it. I mean, they do know that even though Russian war industries are producing now sufficient amounts to conduct the war, Putin admitted many times that against the entire NATO, there's no defense other than nuclear. And this is where it's getting very dangerous. If a moment comes when united Europe backs Ukraine and Ukraine begins to win, that's the end of the world, because the Russians are not going to accept defeat. And they are at that point, when they are defeated, if they are defeated, which I doubt, they may use nuclear weapons, which would be a self-defense. So from that point of view, it seems to me reasonable for anybody who wants to survive this to support any effort to stop the war and find a compromise, which is still possible, but which is getting very difficult.
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode. Wow, that's such a scary scenario, but it's so rational what you're saying. But I'm thinking, because you're saying the very bare minimum that Russia or Putin needs is an ironclad guarantee that Ukraine is not going to join NATO anytime. How can that guarantee be given? Because even if that's been put into law in Ukrainian parliament, any next government, if they have enough majority, they could just overturn that law. So how can that guarantee be?
Yes. I think what the Russians mean by that is a Austrian-type treaty, because in 1955 there was an international treaty. This is why they say it's not a matter of agreement or promises, or just if it's only Ukraine that writes it in its constitution, that's not good enough. This is why the participation of Europeans is essential. They have to be signatories to the treaty, and not as an organization of European Union or NATO. That's not good enough either, because they are not subjects to the international law. It's an organization. Organizations don't mean anything. Today they're there, tomorrow they're not. What Russia wants to do is to first, of course, convince the Ukrainian leadership that they sign this. The second thing would be an international conference that all of European powers would sign and ratify an international agreement on a new architecture of security, like the Helsinki Act of 1975, which would define the borders, which are which couldn't be changed by force, which is what written in 1975, and that NATO is not to expand anywhere. No more countries. That's it. The finished membership. And that neither Ukraine nor Moldova nor any other country can join NATO. And even that's not good enough for many Russians, because they say, what is going to prevent Britain and Ukraine signing a separate alliance? They're both sovereign countries, and then the British would, in accordance with that alliance, put their fleet in Odessa. That's unacceptable. In that case, we better go and take Odessa before it's too late. So it's a very, very tricky situation. But in general sense, what the Russians want is an international treaty, like the Austrian Treaty, which is still holding, which is very encouraging.
Part of the proposal is also that Ukraine will hold elections within the first 3 months.
Yes.
If that was to happen, surely Zelensky would be out of the office and in serious danger to his own life within Ukraine, I'm guessing.
Yes.
So how do you see that kind of becoming an obstacle in the whole proposal?
Well, that actually seems to be quite possible, because when I follow Ukrainian politics, what is clear is that it's a complicated situation. But let me explain how it is. Now, Zelensky is now the spokesman of the super radical nationalists. That's how he positions himself, so that the nationalists and the patriots and others anti-Russian elements support him. But he's not the only one in this, and he's got two competitors. One is Mr. Poroshenko, who is the chief person behind the current anti-corruption attack on Zelensky. He's the one, and Klitschko and several other people. And they're also super nationalists. They want the same thing. They hate the Russians. They want the same thing as Zelensky, except that they don't like Zelensky because he's corrupt and because he's a competitor. He's a rival. But there's another person in the shade, which is General Zaluzhny. Now, Zaluzhny is from the same company. He's a super nationalist and he wants to fight Russia. But there's a big difference, and that is he's got the British support, but which is more important, he's got the support of the army, because he's not corrupt and because the army feels like he's the general who can do something good rather than a politician like Poroshenko. But all of these people are for the continuation of the war. And if there is a honest competition between them, my sense is that Zaluzhny is going to win. However, that's not the whole story, because there's another part of Ukraine which is silenced and which are not allowed to even speak. And these are the ones who are for Russia, who many of them escaped to Russia. Many of these politicians are in Russia. In fact, there's 3 million Ukrainian citizens who continue to hold Ukrainian passports who now live in Russia. Yeah. Now, these people are usually in the eastern part of Ukraine. Like I talked a lot about Ukrainian geography. So it's about half of Ukraine is Russian speaking. And the closer you move west, the more there are Ukrainian speaking. But even among Ukrainian speaking doesn't mean that they're super nationalists. They may also be for Russia for political purposes. Now, what these people are silenced now, but my prediction is, and I dare to say it to you publicly, is that if Zelensky is removed by a vote in the parliament or by any other means, then all bets are off. Then there will be chaos. Then there will be everybody's trying to push his own agenda. And in this case, those who are now silent and are afraid to speak, those that are for Russia, those who would feel that Ukraine should split into two halves and stop this unnatural alliance of the Western nationalists and Eastern pro-Russian. In that case, anything's possible. I can imagine all kinds of scenarios that, for example, Odessa would vote to join Russia, and so is Kharkov. Or I can imagine that central Ukraine would declare nothing, would separate from the nationalists in Lvov and the west of Ukraine, and sign a separate agreement with Russia. In other words, it's totally unpredictable. And I'll take 1 minute to say that the analogy that I have in mind is very, very similar thing happened in February 1917 in Russia. At that time, it was super nationalists, the General Staff, General Alexeyev, who and many other pro-British, pro-French aristocracy, they decided to convince Nicholas II to resign. Why? Because he didn't do a good job of fighting the war. They were super patriotic. They wanted to remove him in order to fight the war better. Now we know the result. The result was everything fell apart. Everything. The whole state apparatus fell apart. And Russia couldn't fight anything at all. And it was the most radical elements on the left, such as Bolsheviks, who seized power. In other words, if Zelensky is removed, especially if he's removed in illegitimate ways, then all bets are off. Ukraine is going to split into warring factions, and then nobody can predict what the outcome would be.
Do you think the Americans realize this as well?
No. I don't think anybody realizes it. I don't think Europeans realize this. I don't think I don't think even Ukrainians realize this. But you see, I wrote a book on that, the Civil War, which is called on Behind the Front Lines of the Civil War, Political Parties and Social Movements in Russia. And just one fact, when you look at the chapters covering Civil War, which was at that time called the South of Russia, which is now Ukraine, there were 18 governments in Ukraine in 1919. 18 governments. It's just totally split into competing factions all over, like little ataman, they were called atamans, which is local military war leaders. The Cossacks separately, the even Ukrainian Cossacks separately from the Russian Cossacks, and the Ukrainian nationalists, and the whites who were for the Tsar. In other words, it was a total mess. That splintered society, just broken into pieces, and therefore, it is very, very dangerous. It would be much better if Ukrainians realize that it's better to survive as a neutral country than not to survive at all.
Yes.
But unfortunately, I don't think they're going to go for it. It seems to me that they go for their own self-destruction. Everything Zelensky does is actually hurting Ukraine as a country more than anything else.
From start, you're right. I'm actually quite surprised. So first of all, after such a long period of fighting, so many lives lost, the country destroyed, so the Ukrainians still want to carry on fighting. Is that because the people who were not interested in fighting have either fled the country or have immigrated to Russia, or the land has been integrated into Russian Federation? So what we have left now is a very different demography than what we started off with. And does that mean, in some ways, it's become a more dangerous place for Russia than what we started in 2022?
No. You see, what I feel is happening in Ukraine is that people are tired of the war. That people are tired of the bombardments and of the hardships and so forth. So if they were given a chance to vote, I think the vast majority of people in Ukraine would vote for any peace right now. That's it, to finish this. However, what the leadership of Ukraine, they are Bandera type nationalists, and you have to understand that these are emotions. They hate the Russians. They really hate them. The hatred is profound, and it would be very difficult to try to explain the origins of this hatred. But it is very strange because in 1914, when the Russian Imperial Army entered Lvov for a very short time, it was greeted as liberators. At that time, Western Ukraine considered itself Russian and Orthodox, and the enemy were the Poles and the Austrians. But then, when the Soviets took over, the Bolsheviks took over with their policies of collectivization and reprisals and so on and so forth, there was this birth of super nationalist Bandera movement that identified the Russians and the Ukrainians, the Russians and the Soviets as one. And that stuck. And that's the origin of this blind hatred of the Russians, behind which is the hatred of the communists and the Soviets and the entire Soviet experience. But they don't differentiate. For them, the communists are Russian, the Russians are the communists, is the same thing. But you see, for that kind of mentality, they will rather die than accept any compromise with the Russians. That's the problem. These people are irrational. Even if you tell them, look, if you continue fight, you lose. And then you lose everything. You will not have even a piece of Ukraine for yourself to say, so be it. But we cannot accept any compromise with the Ruskies. They hate them so much. That's very difficult. It's not a rational European calculation. These people are driven by passion, which is very, very hard to explain or comprehend or accept.
Yeah. Is that a similar kind of feeling that people tend to express in Poland as well? Because there seems to be a lot of fear and hatred in Poland for Russia as well.
Yes, exactly. But with Poland, it's not as bad because I have some Polish colleagues, and there are very many reasonable people in Poland, and many people in Poland who just say, yeah, but they really are not driven by hatred to Russia. And there's a lot of people in Poland among intellectual classes who basically say, well, Russia imposed the communist regime, but it did a lot of other good things for Poland. And it was, first of all, without Russia, the Poles would be a province of Germany today. So, it's different. But the Poles, I think, dislike of Russia is historical. Poland likes to think of itself as a great European power. And in their mind, the Russians denied them that right in 18th century, and they can't forget it. Historical memory in Europe is very, very serious. And it's for this historical reason that the Ruskies are to blame, that we're no longer a great power, that they don't like the Russian. But it's not the same kind of hatred as it is in Bandera, Ukraine. And that brings me to the question you raised in the very beginning of our conversation, and that is the Europeans. I was thinking for a long time about the causes of current German dislike of the Russians. And it's also a very interesting problem because I know German, I lived in Germany, I speak German, I have many German friends, and I studied in Germany. And when I remember Germany of the 1980s, it was a Germany very different from today. It was a Germany that said openly no to NATO. It was a Germany with anti-atom Waffen, a movement against atomic weapons, nuclear weapons. It was a Germany that had very, very good relations with Russia, especially with Ostpolitik and Willy Brandt and in its tradition. And it was a Germany when Putin and Schröder were friends, were actually personal friends. When Putin spoke to Bundestag and both of them spoke about the community of responsibility, this was a very good period, both in societal and business, economic and cultural and political and diplomatic relations. Then what happened? How do we explain this transition of Germany to Merz, who is like a Russia hater, who wants to arm Ukraine, who wants to prepare Germany to fight the Russians? How do you explain that? Well, there are many takes. My take on this, as a person who studied German history and Russian history, is that the Germans are really happy inside down that now they can blame the Russians, that the Russians are exactly the same aggressor as they used to be. In other words, it kind of clears them, it cleans them from the dirt of Nazis. And now they could see, The Russians are doing the same thing. They're invading neighboring countries. They're imposing their own regime. They're killing poor civilians. Now, of course, this is a very false analogy because Russia is not invading foreign countries. Ukraine was a part of Russia for 1,000 years, and they're not imposing anything, and there's no Gestapo, and there's no executions, and then no gas stoves, what the Germans did. But it seems to me that the German guilt feeling of the 1980s and 1990s gave way to a feeling we're not really bad. There are other guys on the block who do similar things, even though they're not similar. So, but I also think that this is only part of the German establishment. But there's another part, which is the those who vote for for alternative for Germany. These people want to have normal relations with Russia, good neighborly relations, and they're growing. So Germany is not sort of monolithically anti-Russian. This political party is growing. They are anti-EU. They're an anti-green agenda. They're conservatives in their values. They are for religion. They're against immigration, and they are for good relations with Russia. So Germany is not a clear-cut case, but Germany, those that vote for Merz, these are the kind of people who are anti-Russian.
Thank you so much for that, because those are two questions that are constantly like a riddle for me. Like, how did a country like Germany allow its state to come to this state where its economy is in tatters, its industry is destroyed, and what benefit did they get out of all of it? And the second thing is obviously this hatred for Russia, not just in Germany but all of Europe. In the UK, when we talk to like people from a certain generation, it's just there's complete distrust for Russians, and it's very hard to break through and have like a rational conversation. Professor, Dr. Brovkin, one question also. So you talked about the nationalists in Ukraine, and you talked about how they're split into three kind of groups. But if we kind of ignore those groups for a minute and just look at them as one entity, how much ground support do they have in Ukraine? How big are they politically? How big is this power?
Well, it's very difficult to say because the opinion polls in Ukraine are manipulated. And when I heard recently Arestovich, who is in exile, a former aide to Zelensky, he claims from his sources that about 18% today support Zelensky. Now, but generally, I would say that the more west you go, the more there is support for nationalists and for various kinds, and that they could vote for Poroshenko or for Zaluzhny, but they're people who are really, as I described before, anti-Russian. However, about half of Ukraine, Poltava, Zaporozhye, and Dnipropetrovsk, all these areas of Russian-speaking people, they don't hate the Russian. They speak Russian. They listen to Russian songs. You probably heard that the 15-year-old girl was arrested for listening to Russian songs. It's absurd. It's as absurd as it was in 1918 in the United States when people were arrested for listening to Beethoven. That's how absurd it can get. So half of Ukraine is Russian. They may be upset now because of the bombs and because of the war going on and discomforts and losses. And many of them lost their loved ones. And obviously they are told that it's Putin's fault. All that creates the constituency of people who are disaffected. But my sense is that this is all very quickly is going to end once peace comes. I think this is all temporary. But my also prediction is that even if Russia could take all of Ukraine, they will not accept Western Ukraine into Russian Federation because this is a Trojan horse. So they will not be admitted to be a part of Russia. So, that creates de facto three Ukraines: the super nationalist Western Ukraine, the neutral kind of a mixed feeling Central Ukraine, and Donbass and Kharkov, Odessa region, which is Russian Ukraine. That's the way I see it.
Yes, interesting, because some of the language that's coming out of the nationalist Ukrainians is so racist and so is similar to what the Zionist Israelis say about Gaza or Palestine. They describe Russians as subhuman, and so yeah, it's very emotionally tied and not based on rationality or an understanding of history. Um, if we look at this peace proposal that Trump has come up with, and if we compare that to what came out from Turkey in March, I think it was 2022, um, do you see any stark difference between what?
Yes. Well, yeah. Alexander Mercouris, who is a British analyst that I admire, he calls it as Istanbul Plus. In other words, the fundamentals are quite similar, except that in Istanbul, the Russians were ready to accept Donbas as the de jure Ukrainian. And now this is gone. Now they want all of Donbas, and also Zaporozhye and Kherson are part of it. That the Russians want to have as a Russian federation. And as I said, there are many serious forces who say the war cannot end unless Odessa is Russian as well, because that's the Black Sea coast and that's strategic importance, etc., etc. So territorial issue, what makes it which makes it different. But I think the fundamental is NATO. Fundamental is foreign troops, and I think that's where it could still work, because look, Trump is not interested in NATO. Trump has very ambivalent feelings about NATO and about supporting Europe, because he feels Europeans are ripping him off the United States. And I think that's the core of agreement between Putin and Trump, that Europe is just wants too much. It wants to be the centerpiece of world politics, but there are other more important things than Europe, and that is what makes it possible for Trump and Putin to find an accommodation resolving the issue of Ukraine. And this idea reminds me of one other important aspect, which is J.D. Vance. And because J.D. Vance represents a part of Republican Party who, from the very beginning, argued that Russia does not have to be an enemy to the United States, because the threat number one to the United States is China. China is an economic giant that has already, by some calculations, surpassed the United States in many crucial areas. And why should we waste so much money and effort on fighting Russia? For what? So that Europeans have access to the Black Sea, or so that British could have their bases? And what do we have from it? In other words, their reasoning is that we should have a deal with Russia to draw it away from China, not maybe to a point of an alliance with the United States, but at least of a counterbalance, so that we could have some leverage against the Chinese, vis-a-vis, not against, vis-a-vis the Chinese, and most importantly, so that the Russians are not, gang-ho go ahead to create alternative to the dollar. And Putin announced many times, we don't mind that there's a dollar as a major currency, but if you push us to a point where we can't trade at all, well, then we're going to invent some alternatives. So it seems to me there's a part of the United States establishment is split between those Trumpists who feel we should focus on China, we should resolve European issues, even if it means playing up to Putin. That's fine, because China is more important. And there are those Atlanticists like Graham and all these other Cold Warriors who hate Russia, and they're still the same as communists, and therefore we should just never allow anything to Russia. We should, he put it like crunching, devastating sanctions so that the Russians do as they're supposed to. So it seems like it's a kind of split establishment on this issue.
Is it more like Western irrationality that baffles me? Because this is what I often think. I mean, USA's peer competitor is China, and yet they keep involving themselves in wars that distracts them and actually weakens them. Wars, whether it's with Russia, Iran, now they're thinking of Venezuela. which is, and at the same time, they keep trying to threaten China and say that China needs to be brought down a notch, and we need to be able to dominate the world as we always have. So
Yes.
I think partially, maybe initially, they were able to convince themselves that if we can defeat Russia, that will weaken China. But in reality, it's just weaken the West
Yes.
itself. So,
That's
so
exactly
yeah,
that was the feeling in 2022, to render Russia strategic defeat so that then they could use more pressure on China. That's exactly was the original
yeah.
motivation. Yes, I agree.
And I think at this stage, no matter what peace agreement we come up with, I don't think they can separate Russia from China now. I mean, things have kind of been put into motion for quite some time now, I think.
No, yeah,
Exactly.
this is too late. Russia's relationship with China is now has gone so far that it is virtually impossible to rule. But moreover, there's economic substance to it, and this is where you look at the economic relationship. Russia needs China. China needs Russia, regardless of any other issues. China needs Russian resources, Russia's oil and other minerals, because Chinese economy is just so big, and it needs so much of input to for its successful growth, that they need Russia. There's nowhere else they could get things that they could get from Russia. The same thing, Russia has a huge border with China, and it also, since it's cut off Western technology, that is a source that makes Russia stronger, because they can get now, as I mentioned before, for the first time in history, this is historic. For the first time in history, you can get things from the East that you could not get before. The West was the only source of high tech. Now there is that same thing in China. And they're the growing up economies of Indonesia and the Thailand and the other tigers. So this is why I think the Russia's pivot to the East is historic and irrevocable. It's going to stay that way. Now, and I think Europe is going to be the biggest loser, because the Europeans just got into the habit of thinking that they're the center of the world. And it's very hard for them to realize they're not anymore. That's it. The train has lost the station. The center of gravity of world production is moving to Asia. This is a historical fact. There's nothing you can do about it. And that's what's happening. And they are very upset about it. Let me add one more thing on this issue, is that I am not at all convinced that the United States or that Trump policies are going to put Humpty Dumpty back together again and make America great again. There's severe obstacles to production in America, to building factories in America. It's so expensive, and they've lost the engineering core and the workers and the work ethic and all kinds of other things. So it's going to be uphill battle for them to just stay even and compete with China, let alone to prevail. And in our conversation, what I find most striking and amazing from a historical point of view is that both Europe and the United States act as if it still is the age of, Western dominance. Yeah. It's like, wake up, people. It's a new age now. It's totally new age. China is a huge industrial giant, and Europe is no longer what it used to be. The best thing you could do is stop all these squabbles and make peace in Ukraine and start normal relations with Russia and try to join the balance of power in the world. And they're doing things that are so ridiculously self-defeating. That's what I think European leadership today, not all of Europe. I mean, if you look attentively, Italy is very, very careful not to offend Trump, and made some steps that is not going to participate in any of these coalition of the willing for Ukraine. The Southern Europe, Greece, Spain, Italy, even Ireland are not at all anti-Russian in a sense as Macron is, and Merz and Starmer. One more word about Macron and why he is so anti-Russian. It seems the answer is very quick and very easy. Historically, I spoke about it in my previous video. Russia and France had very, very close and good partnership and relationship and alliance and good feeling between the countries and the educated people of the countries. What really spoiled it is Macron perceives now Putin as a person who is instigating anti-French sentiment in Africa. What's happening in Burkina Faso and in Central African Republic and all over Central Africa is that the national anti-colonial movement Russia has supported, just like it did during the Soviet times. And now, people are just flabbergasted when they see Africans with the flags of Russia and of Putin in the middle of nowhere in Africa. And I think Macron is very, very upset that French leadership of Africa is disappearing. And that is very painful for the French, because the French, as you know, consider themselves, at first leaders of Europe and then leaders of civilization and then at least Francophone world. And even in the Francophone world, the Ruskies have spoiled everything with their support of this anti-French sentiment. I think that's the real cause of anti-Russian feeling in France, and specifically of President Macron.
Yes. And it is based completely on this colonial mindset of we're civilized and the rest of the world is uncivilized. And the world has moved on from that point of view.
Exactly.
I think the best case scenario would be if Trump's government can realize that they need to come to an understanding between America, China, and Russia and have like a G3 kind of an agreement where they all have their own sphere of influence, but respect boundaries for the others as well, because otherwise they're fighting with reality, which is going to hit them really hard and is going to be very dangerous for the whole world.
Yes, exactly. I agree completely. Yes.
Dr. Brovkin, so in closing, what are your thoughts about this, final thoughts about this topic about the peace proposal in Ukraine? So do you think if Europe could do it, they would still like to derail this whole plan? And they'll probably, with Zelensky, they'll probably say that we agreed to it with some changes because they want to appear like they're on board. But the changes they'll propose will be so unacceptable to Russia that then they can say, oh, see, Russia didn't agree, otherwise we were on board. So do you think if they were able to, would they want to derail this completely, or would they want to go ahead on their own terms in good faith? And do you think the Americans, how hard do you think the Americans would push to get this through?
Well, you see, we're now in a third circle of the same situation. Trump and Putin make an agreement, then it is derailed, and then the Europeans try to persuade Trump that he should join Zelensky in a more vigorous struggle against Russia, and it goes on in circles. It's a third time around. Now, sooner or later, they would realize, as I think Trump has already realized, that the more time passes, the more territory Russians are going to take. And if you postpone it and postpone it, and then next would be Kharkov, next would be Odessa, and it would be still come to the same issues, no NATO expansion. And I think Trump realized that the sooner you conclude the deal, the more of Ukraine would be saved for Western cooperation, investment, whatever, mineral earths. Yeah. So I think Trump really wants to do the deal because he realizes he's going to gain more from it. He's going to gain both for American interests, for American business, and as a peacemaker, and as a person who established normal relations with Russia. I think he's sincere in trying to push this agenda through. Now, whether he's going to succeed, I don't know, because that depends a lot on the internal American politics. And it's very complicated because some of the Republicans don't like his peace initiatives with Russia. They're very, very conservative and they're very anti-Russian, part of the establishment. And he's been really very good in manipulating them and trying to force them to follow his tune. But whether he will in the end prevail, I don't know. One thing that I know for sure is that barring some extraordinary events such as killing President Putin or something else, Russians are going to push on, and they're going to win this war. It is in the interest of Ukraine and the current government of Ukraine is to sign as soon as possible. If they don't, then all bets are off and the Russians will continue. The same thing for Europe. Europe is going to lose more. And for Europe, I think it's when I speak about Europe, I think about von der Leyen, the leadership of the European Union, not all of Europe. Because as I mentioned, some of the Europeans wouldn't be upset at all if Russia won or if the current leadership is discredited. So Europe is in the midst of a change of personnel and trends. America is also split. France is split. Germany is split. We're living in a very interesting time when each of the major participants is going through a historical change of ideas and leadership. And that's why it's unpredictable. This is why we can only identify, major trends that are now going on. But, if we are happy and if we're lucky, some form of the current agreement will be signed. If we're not lucky, the war will continue for another half a year, at most a year, when the Russians take Odessa, and maybe then they would realize they would have to sign, and that would end there. So that's my prognosis.
Yeah, very true. Dr. Brovkin, thank you so much for your time and your analysis. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. And when I'm not speaking with you, I always follow your channel. I'll leave a link to that as well. And I recommend everyone go and watch that. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.